One more round of applause for Mario Matoto, please. All right, I'm very excited to welcome our first plenary session of the Hemispheric Security Conference. This one's going to be looking at great power competition in Latin America and the Caribbean. We have a great moderator to facilitate this session. Andrew Sollinger is CEO of Foreign Policy, a foreign policy leader in geopolitical discussions, and former EVP at Business Insider, Executive Director of Political New York, and Managing Director at the Financial Times Americas. Andrew, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Randy. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Raise the energy level. Wonderful. Good to be here. Great to see you all. And I'm really excited about this discussion and panel. And actually, when Brian asked if we could do a panel here at this incredible meeting and mentioned it would be an hour, I thought, my goodness, how am I going to keep an hour-long discussion running? And then he said, oh, it's with me and John Mearsheimer and Rafael Grossi. And I said, could we have 2 hours? Would that be a better amount of time to use? Really excited for this discussion and to be joined by these august gentlemen. We are here to discuss the big question of the day and this week in this room. How do Latin America and the Caribbean survive and even thrive in an era of great power competition? For years, the Americas has been treated as an afterthought geostrategically. That era is over. From lithium mines to 5G competition, it is now at the forefront for a new kind of competition. And we're going to try and unpack that today. And as I said, we have the dream team to do that unpacking. We have strategic realism, global diplomacy, and regional security, all represented up here. And I'm really looking forward to it. John Mearsheimer, University of Chicago, the world's leading voice on the tragedy of great power politics, if I could say that. Rafael Grossi, the man currently holding the line for global nuclear and energy security globally, and by the way, leading candidate for UN Secretary General. We'll come back to that. And of course, Brian Fonseca, who understands the operational reality of regional security probably better than anyone here. So we're very excited to have all three of you gentlemen. Welcome.
Thank you.
John, maybe we could start off talking about global order and structural shifts. You've long argued that the tragedy of great power politics is inescapable, but as we are here now in 2026, is the international order really in the rearview mirror? Are we firmly in a multipolar West? Or is this just a new chaotic transition to another bipolar kind of bipolarity structure of great power?
I'd make two sets of points about how I think about the world at a macro level. The first point is that we are in a multipolar world, and I believe we have been in a multipolar world since 2017. I was born in 1947, born into a bipolar world, which went away basically in the 1989-91 period when the Cold War ended, and we then saw the Soviet Union break apart in 1991. And from 1991 to 2017, I cannot emphasize this enough, we lived in a unipolar world where by definition there was no great power politics. You can't have great power politics when there's only one great power. It was a unique period in modern history, and it was actually a remarkably peaceful period, certainly from the point of view of great power politics. We are now in a multipolar world for the first time since 1945. Multipolar worlds are very dangerous. Never want to lose sight of that. There are three great powers. The United States is numero uno, China is a close number two, and Russia is a distant number three. And the US-China competition is going to be the defining competition of the 21st century, the competition between those two great powers. So that's what you want to keep in mind. My second cut from a macro level has to do with how the United States thinks about the world. It's important to understand that the Western Hemisphere is the most important area of the world for the United States. It always has been, and it always will be. The reason we pay so little attention to the Western Hemisphere from a strategic point of view is because the United States is a regional hegemon in the Western Hemisphere. We are Godzilla. We face no security threats whatsoever in the Western Hemisphere. That allows us to worry about other regions of the world. I often say to students, have you thought about why the United States is wandering all over God's little green acre, sticking its nose in every country's business? The answer is very simple. It's because we're a regional hegemon and we're free to roam. So then the question is, what areas of the world really matter to the United States? From 1776 or 1783, when we got our independence, up until about 2017, the most important area of the world for the United States outside of the Western Hemisphere was Europe. We always had a Europe first policy. The other two areas that mattered were East Asia and the Persian Gulf. East Asia because there were other great powers there, and the Gulf because of the oil. Since 2017, for the first time in our history, we no longer have a Europe first policy. East Asia is now the most important area of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere. And again, I want to emphasize that the Western Hemisphere is the most important area, it's just that we have no threats there. So when you think about the world today, the two most important things to keep in mind at a macro level are, number one, we live in a multipolar world, and multipolar worlds are very dangerous. And number two, the United States, which has historically focused almost all of its attention on Europe, has begun to pivot away from Europe and pivot to East Asia, because that's where China is, and China is the real peer competitor.
Thank you, John. And just to put a fine point on, we know what happened in 1990, 91, when that non-polar world began. 2017, simply the advent of the Trump administration changed that perspective from Europe to East Asia?
I mean, Trump did that, but what happened in 2017 was a result of structural factors. First of all, Putin basically comes to power in very late 1999, and then between 99 and 2017, he brings Russia back from the dead. And with regard to China, starting in the 1990s, early 1990s, we pursue, foolishly, a policy of engagement toward China. We go to great lengths to help China grow economically. And as almost all of you know, China does grow in a remarkably impressive way from the early 90s up until about 2017. So by 2017, it has so much economic might on top of that huge population that can easily turn it into enough military power to qualify as a great power. So what Trump does is Trump abandons engagement. Very important to understand this. Trump comes in, engagement goes down the toilet bowl, and we, for the first time, adopt the policy of containment toward China. But it's only because China has grown economically and therefore militarily so powerful.
With that type of engagement, I'm just going to add one last follow-up. Do you think without Trump, that type of turn in U.S. policy would have occurred around that time?
Yes, it would have occurred anyway. Just two quick points on that. One is Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State in 2011, was the first person to enunciate the pivot to Asia because she understood that China was rising. But it was not executed by the Obama administration.
Right.
It was Trump who did it. Second point, and this is very important, Joe Biden, who was an arch proponent of engagement when he was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and when he was vice president. He becomes president, as you all remember, in 2020 after Obama. The question you want to ask yourself is, does Biden go back to engagement or does he stick to containment? In fact, he not only sticks to containment, he doubles down on containment, which I think tells you that Trump mattered for sure, but it didn't really matter for structural reasons.
Yeah, so that's great, and thank you for explaining that. And Brian, I wanted to bring you in on this point. So American foreign policy shifted dramatically in that first Trump 1.0 administration, and it has taken a hard industrial turn since then, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about, I think, this week. Was that an aberration, or have we kind of like stripped away the polite fiction of globalization, as John is kind of intimating, and now we're in a permanent, deep, national interest-focused era of global power politics?
No, thanks, Andrew. First and foremost, I just want to say it's an honor to be on stage with you both. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be up here. And Andrew, of course, jumping in and moderating this session. And good to see so many familiar faces, and hopefully I have a chance to meet some new ones. It's an important question. And I think, first and foremost, one thing I just want to annotate, and, yes, the national security strategy pivots very directly to the Western Hemisphere as being sort of the priority in American foreign policy thinking right now. But I would say that's not necessarily to abandon the idea that the United States has been engaged in the Western Hemisphere. It's just often that engagement was below the state. It was the people-to-people connective tissue that was built over decades, centuries, in fact. And so, again, I think there's this, and the other challenge was that the Western Hemisphere is not often a fire in the Oval Office in the sort of contemporary landscape of American foreign policy. But I think the United States has reasserted this idea, and I think two things. One, that the Western Hemisphere is back at the forefront in terms of our policy thinking. And policy thinking, rhetorically, is not the same as sort of the investments that the United States is making right now in the Western Hemisphere to sort of follow that, and we can certainly unpack that a little bit more. But I think the rhetoric is aligned with sort of Western Hemisphere being the priority in American foreign policy at the moment. And of course, that's in a broader context of this strategic denial, global competition with China. China's not written out of the strategy. It's very squarely in sort of how the United States is thinking about engaging, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but broadly across the world. And I think as I interpret sort of a Trump administration 2.0 foreign policy over the last year plus, I think there's three things that I've seen as sort of truths in terms of how the administration has been approaching foreign policy. I think the first is it's this idea of hard values over interests. And that is sort of a downplaying of things like democracy, democratic institutions, human rights, I think in exchange for things that it ties very squarely back to the American interests, certainly here in the homeland as well, things like combating drugs and migration, and of course pushing back against adversarial actors that are operating with degrees of impunity in the Western Hemisphere, pursuing things like resources and trying to deter rivals from sort of acquiring those resources. So I think there's this context of strategic denial, which, by the way, I would argue is not the same kind of strategic denial that we faced at the end of the 19th century, in which we were trying to keep European powers from coming back into the Western Hemisphere. In this context, China is very deeply embedded in the Western Hemisphere, and in fact, it's kind of moved across the open field over the last, quarter of a century to really deepen roots in the region, in a way that the United States is going to have a really difficult time in displacing that. And so I think the United States is going to have to think very carefully about sort of the coercive elements of Chinese engagement in the region, from the things that could contribute, I think, meaningfully to prosperity, while sort of, again, giving the United States the ability to maintain its dominance over the region. But three interpretations. I think one is that interest over values. I think the second is that this administration has been unapologetic about using coercion as part of proactive statecraft. In other words, this administration has been very clear that it's willing to use coercive instruments of national power at the start of the conversation, not in sort of reciprocation, not as a part of the dialogue, but it's going to come out the gate, whether that's tariffing the whole world or leveraging the military instrument as a very sharp instrument to pursue policy change. I think that sort of has been very clear that the administration's willing to use coercion in ways that we haven't necessarily seen in previous administrations, particularly at the onset of engagement. And I think the third is sort of the diminishing appreciation that the administration has for multilateralism. And again, this isn't necessarily a place of value judgment, but I think the administration doesn't want to have conversations about consensus. I think the administration has a very clear understanding of what it sees as its interests, and it's going to pursue that unapologetically. And in the case that multilateral organizations don't necessarily serve that, then the administration is going to pursue it very directly in bilateral contexts. And so I think that sort of diminishing appreciation for multilateralism, in some cases, may be effective in pursuing interests. In some cases, it may be detrimental, I think, to the long-term, opportunities that the United States has to bring, communities together. And against that backdrop, to sort of one annotation, The Shield of the Summit of the Americas was, I think, indicative of that, right? I mean, here in Miami, the administration hosted just over a dozen countries to talk about sort of border security and combating drug trafficking, and I think there was an underlying context of, let's get the Chinese out of the hemisphere. And what was noticeable were the countries that weren't represented in that, and it was countries like Mexico and Brazil and Colombia. And so it was this discussion that the United States was only bringing together like-minded countries. And I think the answer is yes, that was the intention. The intention is we're not here to negotiate our interests. We're going to bring countries together that align with that interest, and we're going to engage. But that doesn't mean that they weren't engaging others, and I think that got lost a lot in the discussion. I mean, Trump, the previous month, had Petro at the White House. There was an open invitation to Brazil's Lula. The intelligence that led to the killing of El Mencho in Mexico was provided in part by the United States. And so I think it's that distinction of, and that's so that third is that there's a diminishing appreciation for multilateralism when it doesn't map directly back to American interests. And then there's a doubling down on bilateralism in order to sort of tease out very specific interests.
That's great. Thank you for all those thoughts and annotations. Clearly, this administration is looking at coercion and then diplomacy rather than the other way around, which is normally the formula.
I mean, it could be coercive diplomacy. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a very sharp approach to engagement where the administration wants to start its discussion at a point where, again, it's leveraging instruments of national power in a very coercive way.
And then also it's a perspective on multilateral institutions, the importance of bilateral negotiations. I see Rafael smiling as I'm hearing you talk about this.
Sorry, Rafael.
So I want to go there, but I'd actually first like to talk a little bit about your role as Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and kind of shift a little bit into the weaponization of everything that we're seeing right now in the world. We used to define security as being a powerful military, and now it's much more than that. It's about the resilience of the power grid, the security of the chip, and the control of a data center. So is traditional security even a thing anymore, or has everything kind of become kinetic in this age of hybrid warfare?
Well, thanks, Andrew. It has different dimensions, of course. We have now the discussion about energy security, which didn't even exist a few years ago. And where I live in Central Europe, you see that in a very powerful way. The war between Russia, the Russian Federation, and Ukraine brought, in a very abrupt, violent way, this reality into the agenda and decisions of many European countries, and in the extended sphere, in the northern hemisphere at least, and of course, going to my own mission in terms of nuclear energy, the way in which the energy structures of many European countries was intertwined with Russia. And the fact that, of course, the war upended that in such a clear way determined that all these countries started taking a number of decisions, for example, doubling down on nuclear because of the autonomy it brings, trying to reconnect after what, in the case of Germany, is paradigmatic, I believe, in this regard. So the energy security discussion is also projecting itself into the Gulf, where we see diversification in a way that is very surprising. Why would the United Arab Emirates build nuclear power plants? What would be it sounds counterintuitive. And today, 30% of the energy is coming from nuclear reactors. So all this multipolarity that John was pointing at is also giving us, making the strategic equation more difficult. If I can refer to a couple of the things we are busy with, for example, Iran, and how we deal with that. We shouldn't forget that this used to be a problem where basically there was an overall consensus, even between Russia, the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom. They were all reacting in the same way vis-a-vis Iran. Not anymore. Not anymore. That consensus that used to exist is gone through the window. So, and this is influencing to a great extent, and perhaps, arguably, I would invite you to think about is one of the reasons why we had war here, because countries do not have this common approach anymore. So what is a problem for Washington and perhaps others is not so much one for Moscow or Beijing. And I will take you even further away. Let's go to Pyongyang, where Russia is saying today that the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is no longer an issue. And North Korea is saying that the reunification is no longer an issue. It has disappeared from the scheme. So I would 100% agree with John when he says this multipolarity is complex and is making all this work far more complicated than it used to be. Not that they were, that there was harmonious, starry-eyed harmony. But when it came to Iran, well, at this UN Security Council, you could count on resolutions being taken either without a vote or in agreement. And that has disappeared completely. So you have to deal with all these issues with competitive and agendas from the central powers.
Fascinating, and it is multi-layered. These interests are no longer converge or even parallel. They completely diverge. John, that's a great point to bring you back in. Is this expanded definition of security, including energy and technology and geoeconomics, actually change state behavior? Or is it just new jargon to describe what is dressed up 21st century, same old power dynamics?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question by piggybacking on what Rafael just said. You have to think about going from unipolarity to multipolarity. In unipolarity, there was one great power, and you didn't have security competition, great power competition between the United States and China, the United States and Russia. So you could get a consensus on Iran. Everybody was on the same page,
exactly,
by and large, because it was a unipolar world, and the United States was Godzilla. So if you think about the world that we're in today, and that the world that most of you came of age in, it's a fundamentally different world, and people are seeing it in terms of a new way of doing international politics. But if you're an old dog like me, and you grew up during the Cold War, what you see today is not that different from what you saw during the Cold War. Yes, it was bipolar, and this is multipolar. But with regard to things like energy, and we worried about oil in the Persian Gulf during the bipolar world. That's when we built the Rapid Deployment Force. We fought wars in the Middle East.
Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Yes, exactly. That went away in unipolarity. Again, you cannot underestimate what a fundamental change took place during the unipolar moment, because there was no great power politics. And just one final point on sort of technological competition. Today the United States is involved in mortal technological combat with China over things like AI, quantum computing, you name it, right? We had a similar situation during the Cold War, where the United States went to enormous lengths to make sure that sophisticated technologies
export controls,
from the West,
yep,
exactly, didn't make it into the Soviet Union. So from the point of view of bipolarity, this multipolarity doesn't look that different. But from the point of view of unipolarity, and this is the problem that you face. You're now in a multipolar world. If you become the head of the United Nations, oh my God, right? It would have been much easier if you became head during the unipolar moment.
More predictable, maybe.
The world's toughest job. We're going to come back to that for sure. And that's really all incredibly fascinating points, John. And we could deep dive on that as well, whether it was U.S. military technology or the commercial technology base that actually defeated Russia, Soviet Union in the Cold War. But would love to, and also, by the way, other things have happened since then as well, like the advent of fracking here in the U.S. and the U.S. becoming completely energy independent and changing that structure. Brian, but would love to bring this back to the Americas. How does this newly defined security apparatus, technology, energy play here in the Americas? And is this digital encroachment destabilizing governments in Latin America and Caribbean right now?
So I mean, pick up on what John said, I think he's absolutely right. I mean, there's maybe not necessarily repackaging, but an evolution and a contextual change in which these security dynamics are playing out. I think certainly that the speed and scale of tech is being disruptive. But I'd kind of note in terms of the regional security context. I mean, we still reside in a hemisphere of relative peace, right? I mean, the zone of peace in Latin America, I think, is a real thing. The threat of interstate conflict is still incredibly low. I mean, I know there's still territorial disputes that we have to reconcile with, but the threat of interstate conflict is relatively low. I think the biggest issue is and I think the region knows this, I think everybody in this room knows this, is the continued pervasiveness of transnational criminal organizations and coercive elements that continue to undermine the solvency and efficacy of democratic institutions. And I think this is where the real issue for the Americas, and that's, by the way, not just, I mean, you look at transnational criminal organizations leveraging drones to fly into police checkpoints in the region. I mean, this is still the premier threat, no matter what the technology or the resource. I mean, transnational criminal organizations, mining gold illegally. So I mean, the problem is that states in the region continue to be relatively weakened. And I think there's this vicious cycle. And in fact, Frank Moore and I talk about this all the time. This sort of vicious cycle where you have weak institutions that afford space for corruption and illicit trafficking organizations to move and penetrate and sort of be coercive elements on the state. And that sort of undermines the ability of institutions to do their job in the region. And that undermines economic prosperity and then fuels transnational criminal organization. Again, you have this vicious cycle that it seems that we have not been able to sort of get right in the region. And I think that the spirit of the last successive administrations is how do we really tackle transnational criminal organization. Oh, by the way, that's in the context of what we're talking about. There's also the element of coercive powers like China, Russia, Iran that are also undermining the solvency of democratic institutions in the region, which continue to fuel the illicit transnational criminal enterprise landscape. And I think that is the biggest sort of, if you want to say, and I wouldn't even necessarily call it non-traditional, but certainly state-to-state conflict. Right. I think that's the big issue that the region faces. All of these things like energy, security, environmental. I mean, illegal fishing off the coast of Peru, Ecuador, and Argentina continue to be incredibly destructive to ecologies and economies, and that is being supported by China, for example. Yep. And so I think those things continue to be really incredibly powerful threats that continue to plague the region that I don't think we've figured out. And I think conversations like this will help us get there.
Non-state actors, very important. Thank you for introducing that. John, you brought up the UN and multilateral institutions. I think we need to get back to that. Can international institutions like the UN, the OAS, the IAEA survive in an era where the great powers see cooperation as a zero-sum game? Are we watching the slow death of multilateralism?
Well, my view on institutions is that they are very important, and they are very important for the United States. The United States has been interested in creating multilateral institutions because there's no way you can run the world if you're a great power without institutions. Institutions are basically rules. And it's very important to understand, as you well know, that we created most of the international institutions in the world. Yeah. And we created them for selfish reasons. They serve America's interests. That's why every president up to President Trump has been a multilateralist. We wrote the rules to our advantage. And we do occasionally violate the rules, there's no question about that, but by and large, multilateralism is a good thing. We now have a president who is the ultimate unilateralist. He thinks that institutions are where the Lilliputians tied down Gulliver, and we have to do everything we can to wreck those institutions. And let's go out and wreck the United Nations and create this ludicrous institution called the Board of Peace. This is laughable, right? We need those institutions. We need international law. And the key point that you want to keep in mind is that these institutions, which were created by the United States, are in our interest. And one of the principal reasons that the United States is in so much trouble all around the world, it's only one of the reasons, is because we have abandoned multilateralism and we have adopted this policy of unequivocal unilateralism.
Okay, Rafael, this is all set up for you, by the way. So you're a candidate for Secretary General. Let's to kind of counter this, and please dive on in. Is multilateralism over, and where have we seen lately multilateral institutions hold the line?
No, it's not over. You have to understand what multilateralism can and cannot do. I think you wrote in the 1990s that international institutions reflect the power structures in the world. They do not shape them. Does that mean that they are useless in the metabolism of international relations? No. And this is the point that I think John is trying to make here. And we can see it. Then, let's descend that into examples. Otherwise, everything is up in the air.
Yeah, please.
When you talk about what's happening in Iran, when you talk about what's happening in Ukraine-Russian Federation, and when you're dealing with certain issues, certain problems, unless you have a structure that is not going to violate the general balance of power and how they have been shaped and the institutionality inside the Security Council, how it works, or the board of governors of the IEA, how it is convened, that makes the possibility of projecting power and at the same time making your political goals viable. When this sounds very abstruse, when you need to inspect a country to see what is happening, you're not going to be doing it with American inspectors. It's not going to work unless you are a defeated power. The short period of Iraq after the war and Resolution 687 of the Security Council. But now you need something different. You need a structure that is going to be there, that others are going to be partaking and tolerating to a certain extent. I mean, China and Russia and the rest, because they know that there is an interest. They are also sharing an interest in this suboptimal, maybe, solution, but still important. And this applies. I was listening to Mike Waltz, with whom I work a lot. He's the American ambassador to the United Nations, and he was making the case. We were together in Los Angeles for the Milken Institution Conference. He was making the case for standard settings in some institutions, at least IMO, ITU, et cetera, and he was telling basically skeptical American audience, we need to be there, because there are all these standards that are set, there are all these actions that we can have when you have international institutions that are operational. And you have to, like you were saying, John, China is a close second. Also in terms of money, when it comes to funding these institutions, China is de facto number one in some of them, and important ones, including the UN, because the United States is in arrears. And the US is paying 22%, China is 20%. It's very, very close. And he's paying, and he's making the point that he's paying. So I think the unipolarity that we are seeing and is leading to the creation of alternative institutions is about also at the UN having leadership and putting its act together in effective ways. Because I don't believe, let me finish with this thought, I don't believe that the fact that you have superpower confrontation makes these institutions completely useless. This is why you have the figure of the Secretary General or the Director General. I could insert ourselves, the IEA, in the middle of the conflict and the war between Russia and Ukraine to avoid a nuclear accident. In September 2022, Zaporizhzhia was being shelled. All right? So we did it, and nobody asked me to go there. It's about negotiating your way in, talking to Vladimir Putin, talking to Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, talking here in Washington, and trying to, find these spaces for convergence that do exist if you know how to find them.
I just read that piece in the New Yorker about your tour into no man's land mission to Zaporizhzhia
Yeah.
and
Well,
that was really you didn't have to do that, but these are examples I presume that you think need to be illustrated to show that a difference can be made. So thank you for that, Brian.
No,
please.
just to add, I mean, I agree with everything that both John and Rafael said. I mean, maybe one other sort of interpretation is that at least the great powers are going to look to leverage institutions in their interests a little bit more directly, or abandon. I mean, the idea that multilateralism dead, I don't agree with, but I do think that, again, countries by obligation may be looking to defend space as opposed to leveraging this space to pursue their respective interests. And when these institutions don't necessarily serve their interests, they may abandon them or at least downplay the relative influence that they give them. And I look back at this region. I look at, for example, the moving away from the Summit of the Americas that was supposed to take place in December and sort of abandoning that for this idea that perhaps the shield of the summit, which would bring a smaller, tighter group of countries together that were far more aligned with U.S. interests. And so, I think that multilateralism will remain, and that's, again, I think it needs to be, front and center in terms of how countries' international system engage in a multipolar system. But I think the powers are going to look to leverage these institutions in their own interests, whether that's pursuing interests in offensive form or defending the space.
That's always been true.
Right.
We wrote the rules that underpin these institutions.
But
It's
the
not like
influence
these
of-
institutions have been pushing us around and forcing us to do things that we can't do. Right? We created the NPT, the IAEA, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, so that we could make nuclear proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation work, and we've done a brilliant job. Those institutions are invaluable.
No, John, I agree. I think in addition, perhaps, is that the administration saw organizations like the WHO and the WTO necessarily not aligned with American interests, and that may be a perception that the administration is taking, which is why it's downplaying. I mean, it pulled out of 60-something international organizations over the last year because it didn't feel that those institutions. And I'm not again endorsing this. I think multilateralism, should remain front and center in a very complex multipolar environment. I think the administration's approach has been, again, it sees those institutions in some cases as strategic risk, and it's looking to downplay, its equities in some of those institutions. But I agree with you; they've been around. I think this administration maybe look at them differently.
John, again, bringing this back to the Americas, you mentioned the moat around the Western Hemisphere. The U.S. really didn't need to focus on it. In the context of the race with China, do you think the region is being underestimated? I mean, I'd love to bring Brian back in a second on what we're seeing right now in Latin America. Is this the new rimland of great power competition, or is it still East Asia?
No, China is located in East Asia. And our principal concern about China is that it will become a regional hegemon like the United States is in the Western Hemisphere. We don't want them to imitate us. As I said to you folks before, and you always want to remember this, the reason that we are free to roam around the world and stick our nose in every country's business is because we are so secure in the Western Hemisphere. What we want is for China to be pinned down in East Asia and have to worry about the local balance of power. We want to put great limits on its ability to roam. So that's our number one goal with regard to China. Our second goal is to make sure that they don't develop a blue water navy that allows them to challenge us in a serious way on the world's seas. The third major concern, and this is where Latin America comes in, is that they will try to project military power into the Western Hemisphere and in effect violate the Monroe Doctrine. There's no question that economically the Chinese are already involved in the Western Hemisphere. But the question is, will we have something like the Cuban Missile Crisis down the road? That's the really big issue. And of course, I would advise any country in the Western Hemisphere to go to great lengths to make sure that nothing that looks like a violation of the Monroe Doctrine ever happens, because that would lead to untold trouble.
So really good points. But there's now a digital sphere of influence that isn't the same as that hard power military projection. And Brian, we've already got Huawei all over the place with 5G networks. We've got Alibaba data centers in Mexico. Is the U.S. Latin America policy lagging behind that? I did a session earlier in the week at NVIDIA with Carl Meacham, who used to be Carl, a congressional staffer, very focused on Latin America, and he called for a Monroe Doctrine for AI. Do regional leaders play the field? How do regional leaders here play the field in between U.S. and China?
I mean, it's tough. I mean, obviously the United States is pressuring countries in the Western Hemisphere to push China out, particularly in spaces like ICT, technology, digital infrastructure. The problem is China is incredibly embedded in terms of the digital infrastructure across the region. I think countries need to balance, sort of the demands to push China out with sort of the benefits that Chinese chip technology has in terms of creating connectivity across the region. I think that this is where sort of U.S. policy needs to think strategically about distinguishing the coercive elements of sort of Chinese influence from those elements that could benefit the region, I think, over the mid and long term. It would be impossible to sort of rip and replace all of Chinese technology across the region. I think that would be something that's just not in the cards. But looking at what elements of coercive, digital infrastructure is in place and looking at trying to move that out. The other big challenge is Huawei and ZTE are willing to operate at a tremendous loss because they're extensions of Chinese foreign policy in many ways. And Western companies are not willing to move into the region and take those kind of losses over the 1 to 3 year ROI cycle. And that's, I think, a big challenge for U.S. and Western companies that want to go into this place. So I think the United States has to be really strategic and thoughtful about how it encourages the region to sort of think about rules of the game. Sovereign AI, sovereign digital infrastructure, where data centers and data flow happens throughout the region to ensure things like citizen security and infrastructure security are preserved. I think that's something that the region has to sort of consider, that the United States, I think, can play a meaningful a role in helping shape some of that. State Department, DFC, and others are really trying to encourage and incentivize American businesses to go down and compete. Again, the success, we'll see how it turns out. It's not incredibly compelling right now because of the risk to environment. But I definitely would caution. I mean, again, from the regional perspective, the degree I can weigh in on that, it's balancing the benefits of China's massive economic opportunities against the more coercive, undermining elements of democratic solvency in the region, and then, of course, undermining the alignment with the United States. And I think that's something you're also seeing, particularly in sort of the Trump administration or the Trump, this sort of Trump 2.0 era, is countries are trying to, balance that engagement. You take, for example, Ecuador, and you take, Argentina, and I have a lot of Argentine family here. The challenges of Malay coming in and saying, we are going to displace China, but yet the economy is so tied to China that the Malay government had to tone that down and focus on more strategic elements like strategic minerals and security cooperation. And sort of the geopolitical elements of that engagement, and kind of leave the economy intact. That's the balancing that I think regional governments are going to have to do.
Interesting. Rafa, would love to future cast a little bit on risks maybe that we're not thinking about staying in the region in the Americas. Is there, looking ahead to the next decade, is there a black swan type risk challenge in the Americas perhaps that we're not thinking about currently? Rafael, that's for you.
Well, black swans in the region, I think we have a pretty good idea of what is happening. We see in terms of economy, energy, etc. I think we should take a look at institutions. We should take a look at transnational crime. I mean, it's amazing that this region that represents 8 to 9% of world's population concentrates 40% of criminality in the world. So I think this is a staggering figure, and that should be looked at very, very seriously, because it has to do, governance, of course, viable institutions are essential. And we are seeing how, even from that perspective of hard politics and international agendas and the capacity of certain nations to penetrate, of course, it's easier when you have institutions that are weak. Western Hemisphere, of course, as John was pointing out, I think there's a factor of hard politics, but also soft ones in the sense that with all its ups and downs and exceptions and aberrations from time to time, the region is relatively adhering to liberal democracy in general terms. Even when we had, we've been suffering from military coups and things like this, they were even invoking democracy as a reason why they were interrupting democracy. So it is something that is there, and it's important, and it's a dimension, since you are asking what is what we haven't discussed this morning. I would point out to that.
Yeah.
Criminality, transnational criminal networks.
John, I know you want to come in. Migration, crime. Do these countries even have time to think about great power competition?
Well, they should think about great power competition. I mean, obviously those other problems are of enormous importance, and I wouldn't want to dismiss them. But you want to understand what's going on here with regard to the US-China competition. And here I'm piggybacking on what Brian said. The United States has never confronted a security competitor as formidable as China. The two building blocks of military power are population size and wealth. And during the Cold War, when it was the United States versus the Soviet Union, you had two countries that had roughly the same size population. And in terms of wealth, the ability to generate wealth, develop sophisticated technologies, we were superior to the Russians or to the Soviets, right? So we had significant advantages during the Cold War. We are now up against a competitor that has 4 times the population of the United States and may not only be able to compete with us, but may beat us in terms of developing sophisticated technologies. The Chinese are truly impressive, as anybody who's gone to China knows. They got a lot of people, a lot of gross national product, and they are going to compete with us all over the world. And this is the situation that you're describing, and you folks all know better than I do, that you see in the Western Hemisphere. Chinese penetration, sophisticated Chinese technologies that you'd like to buy for all the obvious reasons. That situation is not likely to change to our advantage, our meaning the United States. I worry that it's going to change to their advantage. So there's going to be more Chinese influence, I think largely economic, maybe ideological, maybe coercive along the lines you're describing. If it's military, then you begin to violate the Monroe Doctrine. But even if you don't violate the Monroe Doctrine, that US-China competition that I described before, which is the centerpiece of multipolarity, is going to have a profound effect on your lives moving forward. My final point that I want to emphasize, this is to show you how remarkably foolish the United States has been. We, starting in the early 1990s, decided to help China grow economically. We purposely helped China become the great power that it is today. You were bad-mouthing the World Trade Organization. We let the Chinese into the World Trade Organization in 2001. And by the way, this policy of engagement, I was one of the few people on the planet who opposed it, was pursued by both Democrats and Republicans. So it's not like the Democrats are the bad guys or the Republicans are the bad guys. And the end result is we created Godzilla. And now we have to try to figure out how to live with it.
On that positive note, so as I mentioned, Brian, I knew we would need more time. This could keep going on forever, but really a fascinating discussion. We covered great power competition, the impacts in the region, the future of multilateralism, a tremendous amount of ground. And before we thank our panelists, I just wanted to say, shameless plug, there's a card on your chairs for a new podcast that we're producing with our colleagues at FIU about hemispheric security. You can download it by hitting this QR code, and we're doing some great interviews here on it also. Shameless plug over. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much for participating with me in this panel. Please join me in thanking Rafael, John, and Brian.
Well done.
Thanks, that was great.
What an excellent discussion. Thank you again to our great panel. One more round of applause for them, please.